The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, why America's middle class is barely getting by, why the fight against climate change also has to be a fight against inequality. Plus, Bill Press interviews Lanny Davis, former special counsel to President Bill Clinton. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. For her most recent book, author Alissa Quart tracked the daily life of America's middle class. What she found were people too often living paycheck to paycheck and struggling just to get by. And we say hello to Alissa Quart, who's Executive Director of the Economic Hardship Reporting Project and the author of 6 books. Her most recent is Squeezed: Why Our Families Can't Afford America. Alissa Quart, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. In this book, you use a term that will be new to many of our listeners. It is middle precariat. What does that mean?
So the middle precariat means middle class plus precarious plus proletariat. So what I was trying to do was come up with a term that would explain what we're seeing when we're seeing lawyers working doing document review by the hour, when we have professors who make $20,000 a year and live from job to job, when we have nurses who are often seeing their jobs being destabilized by automation. So it used to be working class and even a working poor phenomenon to have precarious labor. And the argument I make in Squeezed is it's become everybody. It's become basically the middle class as well.
This hardly is a book of impersonal statistics, but rather full of stories. Introduce us to some of the people that you write about.
So, yeah, I talked to 100 people, or maybe even more. They were teachers who had to drive Uber in their off hours, grading their papers at stoplights, or even driving their students' parents because they weren't making enough to live in the areas that they were teaching in. It was an adjunct professor with a disabled son. It was mothers who raised money for maternity leave or daycare on GoFundMe because only 14% of Americans have paid family leave. It's lawyers who were weighed down with massive debt, making a fraction of what they made before the Great Recession. It's hard to feel sorry for lawyers, but I managed to in this book. In Tennessee, less than half of law degree holders are working as lawyers. They have this term now, excess lawyers, and they use that to describe that in all but 3 states.
And Alissa, this book, of course, addresses why this is happening, and there are many reasons. One is the increasing cost of living middle-class life. What are the main expenses that are driving this change?
Sure. So it's the number that I'm using is middle-class life is 30% more expensive than it was 20 years ago. And what we're talking about, again, is things like daycare. In New York City, where it's astronomical, it could be up to $32,000, $35,000 a year for daycare. But if you have many kids, you may be paying that anyway in a more reasonable state or city. And so daycare not being subsidized except for the poorest is a huge expense. Also, education, parents' own education and their children's education, their higher education. People are just sinking in debt. I think it's some enormous amount right now. And there's medical debt as well, and the cost of medical insurance. People are buying their own insurance. And finally, it's things like real estate, because in cities like New York, San Francisco, LA, Washington, D.C., where you guys are, it's so expensive now to own a home. You have millennials who now, home ownership is way down just simply because they can't afford to own a home. And many of the people I spoke to thus can't afford to start families.
And it just keeps stacking up higher and higher and higher, especially for those millennials who are already probably juggling a lot of debt with paying for school. And it's a never ending cycle, it seems. You also write about the nature of work itself. What's important to understand about how the way work has changed?
What I was really interested in was, first of all, how we conceptualize work now. I mean, I think we think about work and home, the roles have reversed in some ways, that we see work encroaching on our home lives. And I'm always wondering, why can't work be more like home rather than home more like work? But it means that people need to work more than one job in order to make their ends meet. 30% of Americans are doing something else for pay in addition to their full-time jobs, according to an NPR survey. People call these things side hustles. And places like Forbes smile at this term, but I think it's kind of pointing at something slightly ominous. And then you have people who are working in odd hours because they're being scheduled that way by their giant corporations. So in my book, I follow a 24-hour daycare. And you might say, oh, this is the really extreme. Who uses 24-hour daycares? But nowadays, 9% of American families use these daycares in strange hours, meaning late at night, on weekends, early in the morning, right? So I embedded myself in this daycare, and it reflected the new terms of American labor, that people work till 8 or 9 in the evening and sometimes overnight. And who's suffering from that? It's the workers, but it's also the kids.
Absolutely. We're speaking with Alissa Quart, Executive Director of the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, author of numerous books, and we're talking about her most recent, Squeezed: Why Our Families Can't Afford America. Alissa, women play a big role in this book. Why did you make that choice?
Well, I feel like a lot of books about labor emphasize men, and they have historically, and I think there's sort of this romantic idea of the male worker for many people who study labor, et cetera. But for me, first of all, women are now the backbone of the workforce and working class workforce. But also, I kind of wanted it to be a secret stealth theme where women were actually at the heart of it, but it wasn't a woman's book. So male readers would find themselves suddenly identifying with all these women struggling to support their families, and they'd be like, oh, I'm reading a book with a lot of women in it. I also think that in family life, the pressure, economic pressure, often falls on women because they're trying to do their work now, their jobs, and they're also sort of deeded with the responsibility of daycare and maternity leave. And so, 14% of women have paid maternity leave, so this makes us very vulnerable to these economic pressures, particularly vulnerable. And that was part of why I wanted to focus on this, on women's loss in my book.
Absolutely. You also you write very compassionately about the sense of loss and shame that comes with being part of the middle precariat. You call it suffering death by 1,000 degradations. On this point, what are you saying to your readers?
I'm saying it's not your fault. That we need to stop blaming ourselves. We've internalized this bootstrapping ideology that makes us feel like every struggle we have is our responsibility, and every issue we have as a family is only our family's problem. But one of the things this book showed me, and actually having a family myself, is so many families look like mine, and look like families who are even having a harder time than mine it was, and that part of what we need to do, instead of feeling this shame and this responsibility, is talk openly with our friends and family about our financial situation and our efforts, just so at least it's not contained and trapped within ourselves. Ideologically, I think we're in an extreme country because we have this sort of self-reliance dogma, and I think we need to start dismantling some of those insistent storylines because it's weakening all of us, and it's distracting us from what's important.
And you're doing a lot of events and interviews, and you're hearing from people who identify with this story. What are they telling you?
It's kind of disturbing. I'll give these readings, and people will say, I'm a squeezed person. And sometimes I'll be flattered, but I'll also be saddened that this is a handle that people identify with so much. People feel like no one's listening to them. I've got hundreds of letters. For instance, one read, I found this for you. My husband read your book and felt slightly vindicated for his perceived, quote, failures, unquote. So recommended I read it in the hope that it might make me feel somewhat less ashamed of our reduced circumstances. And it did. So that's the kind of email I've been getting. And, people also write about how social media, which is a theme in my book too, has increased, one woman writes, exponentially the level of misery. I think Facebook has increased exponentially the level of misery felt by those of us who just didn't get the life we thought we would, being well-educated. My friend's endless feed of trips, conferences, stellar romances only compound the sense that I must have done something terribly wrong somewhere along the way. And I did do something wrong. I majored in psychology. So, I mean, it's dark and disturbing, but I also felt, wow, I had this, I'm creating like a common identity where people will stop privatizing their suffering, which is kind of what I think we do in this country. And I don't know. When I was in Boston for a reading, an academic came up to me and said, I'm selling my plasma. Thank you for writing this. I was like, wow. I didn't even know that it had gotten that bad. Yeah.
Now, Alissa, we can't leave this conversation without talking about solutions. What are some of the reforms that you advocate to offer relief to the people you're writing about?
Okay, so there are big reforms and there are small reforms. Like the big reforms are things like mandatory 2-week paid vacations for all workers. We are the only industrialized nation without a single legally required paid vacation day. And even employees with paid vacation days are using fewer and fewer of them. And that's really important. Look, I'm a mom of a 8-year-old. When there's a snow day or when there's an additional holiday, I make my own hours. I run my own nonprofit so I can take it off and take care of her. But if I didn't have those vacation days, what would I do? And I think about that a lot. Things like, student debt forgiveness. As a country, we owe $1.5 trillion in student debt. So I think after we get beyond the shame that I'm advocating for, get beyond the personal shame of debt, we have to allow student debtors, and many of them are in their 40s, right, to be able to declare bankruptcy related to student loans. And now it's impossible right now to do that, by the way, or even to obtain debt forgiveness. So I'm really advocating for a changed attitude towards student debt because I talk to people in their 50s carrying it around, carrying huge amounts, hundreds of thousands, for themselves and their children. I thought, what would their lives be like without this burden?
A completely different world, I'm sure. I mean, how could it not be?
Yeah. And also, things like paid maternity and paternity leave. The U.S. is one of only 8 countries, along with Papua New Guinea, without a national law guaranteeing paid parental leave. So you're like, I gave a speech recently in Croatia about my nonprofit where we advocate for journalists who are lower income. And I thought they'd be surprised by some of those stories, but they were most surprised by the fact that we didn't have paid maternity and paternity leave. And the healthcare, they couldn't believe it. So I was just thinking, these are kind of basic things that would really go a long way to helping the people in my book.
Absolutely. And the book is called Squeezed: Why Our Families Can't Afford America. Alissa Quart, Executive Director of the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, joining us today to talk about that. Alissa, thank you so much for your time with us today. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the link between climate change and inequality. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Mighty ExxonMobil now finds itself in federal court, finally being called to account for the true cost of the damage that its oil and gas operations are doing to our climate. This lawsuit points out that it's easy to be exorbitantly profitable if you don't have to include your enormous pollution costs on your corporate books. Technically, the lawsuit charges that Exxon kept two sets of financial books, one acknowledging internally that its pollution was devastating our climate and would eventually cost both shareholders and taxpayers a fortune, and the other, a rosy public presentation hiding those costs in order to puff up profits and claim that fossil fuels are more cost-effective than wind, solar, and other clean energy sources. This blatant deceit has defrauded shareholders about the actual value of their investment, diverted public policy from non-polluting fuels, and accelerated the radical impacts of climate change. While the lawsuit will largely focus on arcane aspects of securities law, it's fundamentally about corporate morality. As environmental activist Lee Wasserman recently put it, we're victims of a small group of gargantuan companies that recklessly and deliberately ignored the implications of their own science and worked to deceive the public. Indeed, their recklessness continues. Even though Exxon now admits the damage its products are causing, Wasserman notes that the behemoth is planning to increase its oil output by 25% by 2025. This is Jim Hightower saying, of course, any monetary fine the corporation might have to pay will only be a tiny fraction of its yearly income, so that's not the real deterrent. Rather, the real punishment is that Exxon and its executives are finally being revealed as the same morally repugnant profiteers as the soulless tobacco industry has been.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. James K. Galbraith is one of the world's leading economists. He says rising inequality in the world today is fundamentally unsustainable and at odds with what needs to be done to confront the realities of climate change. And we say hello to James K. Galbraith, Chair in Government Business Relations at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, University of Texas at Austin. His most recent books are Inequality, What Everyone Needs to Know, and Welcome to the Poisoned Chalice, The Destruction of Greece and the Future of Europe. James K. Galbraith, welcome back to the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you very much.
You recently wrote an op-ed titled The Unsustainability of Inequality, in which you addressed why inequality should play a bigger role in how we think about sustainability. First, how are these two ideas connected?
Well, the point of the piece was that when you look at our measures of inequality, you find that they are very, very closely related to it. In fact, really a product of the financial trends in the economy and the cycle of boom and bust, the credit cycle, if you like. And that is when inequality is going up, it's largely because of concentrated financial activity in one area or another, which is an intrinsically unsustainable process which has a tendency to result in collapse. So I argue there's just a very close relationship between what we think of as often think of as a static phenomenon, the degree of inequality in society, and this very dynamic time centered phenomenon of instability, which is and sustainability, which are concepts that have become increasingly prominent in our discourse lately.
You also write about how inequality drives what some, I guess, are calling a new plutonomy, characterized by conspicuous waste. Again, how do these ideas relate to sustainability?
Well, just for example, if one has a boom in a particular sector, or if one has consumption that's being driven by the very wealthiest people in the society, which is a concept that's come to be known as plutonomy, with a small number of people are driving the driving overall growth by their very extravagant consumption habits, then you have a relationship between the overall functioning of the economy and the degree of inequality that's developing.
And you've also written about the inability of current financial structures to cope with the needs of mitigating climate change. What makes them unable to meet that challenge?
Well, they have no incentive to meet it. They have no mandate to meet it. Their regulatory structures are not pressuring them to meet it. So you're looking at a financial structure which is largely oriented toward its own profitability, toward its own dominance in the economy, and not toward any larger social objective. So when you come in and say, okay, now we have to undertake a major investment and program of investment and transformation in order to deal with the climate threat, you're going to have to construct a financial structure that is a financial sector which is capable of handling that challenge. That's what happened in the aftermath of World War II in Europe. In fact, in the New Deal in the United States, when we needed to do things, we created financial institutions in order that would facilitate and promote and make possible from a financial side the accomplishment of those goals. But if you leave it in the hands of the existing financial structure, simply mixing oil and water is not going to work.
And then there's also paying for it. And I know you've written about the argument, at least in relative to Europe, where it's taxation versus borrowing to pay for it, which is a big issue. And is that also a stumbling block for moving forward?
Well, once you have an objective and once you know what your what real resources you're going to require in order to achieve a particular set of goals, and in particular dealing with the demands of a Green New Deal, then the question of whether you fund it in advance with bond issues or out of current revenue with taxation is a question you then have to face. In my view, so long as you have real resources that have not been mobilized, then you should fund in advance, because what you're going to do is create a new system that will that you can then use to service the bonds. Funding everything out of taxes at once, it runs into an enormous political problem, and then you're asking people who have become dependent on the previous technologies, on fossil fuels in particular, to take a major hit in their living standards while the transition is going on, and they're not going to be willing to do that. And that's the issue that was faced in France that led to this yellow vests protests, which are still ongoing. You've got to work out a way to make the transition in a way that is socially stabilizing, that permits people to continue in a reasonably normal way with their lives while the transition is underway. That's a huge challenge.
Absolutely. Now, in thinking about how to close the inequality gap, your recent op-ed also addresses some of the shortfalls in the way mainstream economists measure inequality. What are they missing?
Well, we have a lot of different measures of inequality, and there are difficulties with all of them. The question I raised in that article, and I've looked through a series of these things, is where do we get the most reliable view of what's going on in the world economy from the standpoint of the measurement of inequality? Tax records have deficiencies simply because, just for example, there are not that many countries which have income tax in which we have a reliable, continuous, unchanging record of what the taxes are actually being taken out of, what the tax laws state. So you have the surveys have a problem of not getting at some of the richest people in the society. So in every measure, there are difficulties. What I offer is that with a certain type of measure, which we've been working on for a number of decades, you get a pretty good fix on the relationship between inequality and these larger global financial phenomena. And that's what emerges from trying to just develop a consistent data set and consistent set of measures that cover a lot of countries over many years, so that you can see that when the debt crisis hits in the 1980s, when the financial crisis hits, when the Asian crisis hits in the 1990s, these things have an effect on the inequality of a great many countries, and they do at the same time.
We're speaking with James K. Galbraith, Chair in Government Business Relations at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, University of Texas at Austin. And so in your own research, you're finding a deeper story about inequality, that it is a much more global phenomenon than previously observed?
Oh, sure. And that's essentially a major contribution of our work, is to show that there is a globalized pattern, that this is, in fact, related to the way the world financial system is run. And therefore, when things happen that are generated in Washington or New York or London, which are the centers of global finance, this ripples out over the whole world economy. And it doesn't affect every country in exactly the same way, but you can see a common pattern. And that just says that the world really is a largely single functioning financial unit, and it's subject to the same pressures and the same predatory effects and to the same effects on internal inequality in countries that are basically being generated in the richest countries and by the financial system.
And if inequality is growing all over the world, and obviously, as you say, it's not going to be the same in each country, do you see parallels in political movements around the world in terms of the popularity of authoritarian politics?
Well, inequality, the big rise in inequality that we saw was really for a period from 1980 to 2000. After that, there was a substantial stabilization, and you could see a retreat from the neoliberal policies that had been introduced under Reagan and Thatcher and spread around the world by the international financial institutions. And you could see, as a result of that, in part, you could see a stabilization of inequality. I think it's gotten worse again in the last 4 or 5 years. But what you learn from this is that, yes, indeed, policies do matter. It is possible to stabilize inequality if you have countries which are willing to take the appropriate measures and to begin to deal with extreme poverty, as, for example, Brazil did under left-wing governments for about 15 years. Then you can see you actually see this progress shows up in the data. So it's consistent with what common sense would tell you, is that there is a way in which the human societies can handle these issues, but it requires persistence, it requires stability, and it requires a determination to make major social changes, and all of that's politically, of course, very challenging.
I'd like to close with kind of a broad brush question for you, Professor. What kinds of solutions can begin to address global inequality?
Well, I think we need a full-scale reform of the global financial system. We cannot run the world, global economy, and deal with the overpowering question of climate change if we continue to allow the world economy to be directed by a handful of basically self-absorbed private financial institutions. You have to have a system which is able to place that mechanism, that entire global system, under a set of controls and make it serve the social purposes that we have.
James K. Galbraith, Chair in Government Business Relations at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, University of Texas at Austin, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Professor, as always, we appreciate your time, and we look forward to doing this again with you soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks impeachment with the man who ran Bill Clinton's impeachment war room.
Do you believe that this impeachment inquiry is justified?
Yes, but I am concerned about the Democrats raising expectations too high. He's going to be replaced at the ballot box, I believe, and we need to be sure that that foundation as to the rationale for going forward, knowing that it's almost certain that we won't have a two-thirds vote in the Senate, and that it's the ballot box that should decide. So that's a kind of a message concern about the impeachment, but I do believe it's justified in that he will be impeached in the House of Representatives.
Justified on what grounds?
Well, I was on the fence about going through a fruitless exercise and losing a lot of the persuadable voters by doing so until I recognized this is about our Constitution. If the House of Representatives doesn't vote an impeachment resolution based upon this lawless and reckless behavior, then all that the framers wrote into the Constitution to check an unprincipled and unchecked executive might be a terrible precedent. So at the very least, the asterisk in history by his name that the House voted to impeach his reckless and unconstitutional behavior, I decided after quite being uncertain that we needed to go forward.
From what you've seen and from what we've heard, was there a quid pro quo offered by the president to the president of Ukraine?
The answer is yes, by the plain language of what he said in the summary of his telephone conversation, much less all the corroborating evidence by other witnesses that I now gather are corroborating through text messages and others. But I want to remind your listeners that we don't need a quid pro quo for an illegal act to have occurred. It is illegal, much less a reckless abuse of power, to ask and solicit a foreign government to interfere in our election because of an advantage that is a personal advantage for the president, not an advantage in the public interest. That's illegal. There were indictments put down by Mr. Mueller for a bunch of Russians interfering and corrupting our U.S. political system. There are statutes violated if you solicit a foreign government to do so. And one can go through the various other possible violations of the law. So the quid pro quo is just, as far as I'm concerned, an additional crime, either bribery or the crime of campaign finance donation that's illegal from a foreign government. But there is enough with that quid pro quo. I don't know why Democrats don't start by saying what I've just said, because the quid pro quo argument is now pretty much settled. Mulvaney, sometimes you get into trouble when you speak the truth. But I do think, yes, there's evidence of the quid pro quo.
Now, the Trump White House has spent less time defending the substance of the call and attacking the process that is underway as not being due process, not being fair, being behind closed doors. You've been through this before. How do you believe Adam Schiff and Speaker Pelosi are conducting the impeachment inquiry? And then I want to ask you about how Trump's responding, but how the Democrats conducting?
Very poorly. They're not explaining. And my line of work is you have to explain and put the facts out. I have no idea why Adam Schiff isn't doing a better job. He's a great communicator. Or why the speaker doesn't recognize this as a laughable lie, that the hypocritical lie. Of all people, Lindsey Graham conducted a behind-the-scenes series of investigations and depositions during the Clinton impeachment. And certainly we know about Benghazi and Trey Gowdy on the record explaining why you needed to have private depositions. I just don't know why the Democrats haven't been more proactive in combating a laughable, hypocritical argument that there's something unusual about closed-door depositions before you go public. Now I think they've got to move the clock up and go public and then just get rid of this silly argument, hypocritical argument Republicans are making.
Is it correct to compare what's going on right now to sort of a grand jury proceeding, which precedes a public trial?
Yes, the unfortunate part is that it's different. So the Republicans will seize on the difference between a criminal grand jury and a political civil impeachment. So yes, it's comparable, but I would more likely, if I were messaging this for Mr. Schiff, point out what was done in 1974, when the Nixon impeachment occurred, were months and months of private investigation. The Alexander Butterfield disclosure of the White House tapes occurred during a closed-door interview. In 1999, the Republicans spent much time behind closed doors taking depositions and creating their body of evidence. That's why Lindsey Graham's on record defending it. So we ought to be going right to an apples and apples hypocrisy. I certainly like the Trey Gowdy example. Congressional investigations don't occur first in public testimony. They occur in depositions, and then you create from the deposition record a better and more efficient hearing. So to me, those are better examples. But yes, grand jury secrecy is another example where you don't put things out into the public arena before you ask your questions in the private sector.
Now, I remember the Clinton impeachment days, and I remember dealing as a journalist with you at the White House, running the Clinton war room, I guess you could call it, with your aide, Chris Lehane.
The great Lehane.
The great Lehane, right. How is the Trump White House handling their response to the impeachment inquiry, do you believe? I mean, I have to say, you are the master in messaging and being on target and responding to every criticism and every charge. How's the Trump White House doing?
So badly is a compliment. Because when you have zero or worse than zero, saying something's bad is actually a compliment. They have a major problem in having any war room because you have a client who lies. How do you what is a war room is putting facts out to rebut misinformation. That's the definition of a good war room. And the efficiency of getting your facts out in a simple, understandable message is kind of what I do. But you have to have facts, and you can't have facts if your client is lying to his lawyers and lying to everybody. That's their problem. And maybe on your podcast I can disclose that I've actually received phone calls from people within the Trump White House over the last couple of years, professional to professional, friend to friend. In past years, they've asked my advice. And it is a published fact that Steve Bannon actually called me and used my name as a noun with Mr. Trump saying we need a Lanny Davis. And that was published as an anonymous source. And he called me to say I'm the source, and we kind of had a funny conversation. But they can't have a war room because Trump is a compulsive liar. I'm not using a label. I'm not making a political attack. I could say that about Trump. I'm stating a fact that is literally undeniable. A sociopath doesn't know the difference between truth and a lie. I know that he lies. I sometimes think he knows that he lies and that we know that he lies. But you can't have a war room with somebody who is lying. You have to use facts to rebut what is being said in the attack that's being made.
So what should they do?
I'm pausing because there's nothing they can do about a person who's mentally, I think he's mentally ill. He's certainly mentally unsuitable because he doesn't know the difference between truth and falsehood. So if I'm representing somebody who doesn't know the difference between truth and falsehood, I resign. And I have for many clients, I wouldn't say a large number, but enough. If I feel they're not telling me the truth, I don't take a moral position. I say, I can't help you. So anyone in the White House who's trying to help Trump in a communications field should resign because their reputations will, as it occurred in one specific case, are gone forever.
If it's not Donald Trump who is out there, it's often, and particularly lately, Rudy Giuliani, lawyer to lawyer. How do you assess his role in this? Helpful or hurting?
Let me try not to be using labels. Just for starters, I think there's something mentally wrong with the man. I can't find no other explanation for some of the things that he's done, and there's a problem there. But let me just speak as a lawyer. He has acted clearly to waive attorney-client privilege and injure his client without apparently caring. He has spoken about the advice he's given to President Trump, which means that all advice is subject to cross-examination by anybody that wants to serve him with a subpoena, because you can't assert attorney-client privilege. Once you waive it a little bit, you waive all of it. So just as a fellow lawyer, I would say he's shown very poor judgment and doesn't seem to care and probably thinks he's above the law the way his client thinks he's above the law. But that's really my comment on Giuliani, is that his judgment raises questions about his mental stability.
And his role in basically conducting a parallel track of foreign policy based on getting political dirt on Joe Biden in return for holding up military aid, open him to charges?
For sure. It's a criminal act to solicit a foreign government to interfere in our presidential elections. That's what President Trump did. It's a crime. Rudy Giuliani is part of a criminal conspiracy to do so. His failure to register under the Foreign Agent Registrations Act, he claims an exemption as an attorney. He's wrong. Once you get into the public arena doing public advocacy, you're not acting as an attorney, you're acting as a public advocate, and FARA is a requirement to register. So there are a number of other laws that he has violated. I think right now his apparent being under criminal investigation doesn't faze me, because that doesn't mean he's guilty if you're being investigated. But I do know that soliciting a foreign government to interfere in an election is a crime, and he was part, undeniably so. He would say, yeah, I did that. What's wrong with that? I think he's going to find out when a grand jury looks into it, and he might get indicted.
So as we talked about, this is not your, for as far as impeachment goes, it's not your first rodeo. I checked this morning, October 8th, I'm sure, and date etched in your mind, October 8, 1998, 21 years ago, the impeachment of Bill Clinton. Looking at that process and this process, what differences do you see?
Well, the challenge that we faced in our war room is the big difference. We finally figured out, the American people were way ahead of us, that there was a distinction between personal behavior that was severe and, in many people's minds, indefensible. The American people could distinguish that personal weakness, to say the least, that President Clinton had to own up to. And he owned up to, let me remind you, on international television in front of a grand jury. And he apologized publicly. But that personal issue, the American people, way before those of us in Washington understood, made a distinction versus his performance in office. He left office with a 65% approval rating. That's somewhat equivalent to President Trump's disapproval rating. He's getting close to 65%. He's about at 60. But that's the big distinction. Personal mistakes, serious, that he owned up to. versus abuse of power. And abuse of power is the standard for impeachment and removal, as Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and others who wrote the impeachment clause believed.
It is stunning, the difference between what they impeached Bill Clinton for and what Democrats are looking into with the behavior of the, as you say, as president, his abuse of power as president with Donald Trump.
Well, it's really important to understand that reason for the impeachment clause was to check on an unprincipled executive. A lot of people were opposed to having a president at the convention. And you're absolutely right. The distinction is very, very serious that when they wrote into the Constitution, the only check on a lawless president would be impeachment and removal.
This week, we saw Donald Trump's attorney in a related case, but in also unrelated, dealing with his tax returns. His attorney in front of a federal court in New York argued that the president could not be indicted ever, not even if, as he once bragged about, he went out into the middle of Fifth Avenue and shot someone, that local authorities could not prosecute him for that. How do you react to that argument?
Well, it's an argument. It's an opinion that's never been litigated. So people forget the basis of this opinion is a legal memorandum. It's not a court decision interpreting the Constitution, certainly not a Supreme Court decision.
But does even the Justice Department, that famous memorandum, would go that far?
It's one of these hypotheticals that you could say the memo says that, but then the writer of the memo would say, well, I never meant that. And these types of hypotheticals that lawyers can play with, like when you're in law school, you get a hypothetical like that, is only going to be determined using common sense. If you ask James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, do you intend to immunize a president from committing premeditated murder? They would say, of course not. But it's got to be litigated. The fact is he can be indicted and can be convicted of a crime. Then it would be appealed and the Supreme Court would decide. But in terms of what he can be, of course he can be indicted. There's nobody to stop a grand jury from indicting him.
But it says something, doesn't it, about Donald Trump's view of the presidency, that he would even instruct his attorney to make that argument.
Yes, he just recently said that he doesn't believe in the 22nd Amendment. He could stay in office for 20 years. One thing that Michael Cohen told me, who I represented, as you know, early on that helped me decide to represent him, is when he said, I am 100% convinced that he will not peacefully give up power. And Elijah Cummings, may his soul rest in peace, commented that that was one of the scariest moments when he interviewed Mr. Cohen before they decided to hold the hearings, that it sounded true. And to me, I think that Trump believes it. So the answer is, at this point, there is no check on his power other than the ballot box in 2020. And my sense is if he thinks that he can stay in the White House and order a coup, he needs a Pentagon that would back him. And I don't think there's anybody in the Pentagon that would order anybody to defend Donald Trump's unconstitutional decision to stay in power.
Bill Press talking with Lanny Davis, former special counsel to President Bill Clinton. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressShow.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Alissa Quart, James K. Galbraith, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.